ready to dive deep into C.S. Lewis.
Always up for that.
This time, we've got a collection of his essays, most from the 40s, where he's looking at Christianity, how it fits into the modern world.
Not Narnia this time.
No talking lions today, sadly.
Though,
gotta love Aslan.
right.
But, we're going deeper than children's stories to see how Lewis, he was a pretty renowned Christian thinker, how he saw faith, up against science, morality, even like all the societal changes happening back then.
And, going through these essays, what really hit me was how relevant they still feel. Like, it's been decades, but Lewis had this way of cutting through all the noise and getting right to the heart of things, those dilemmas that just never go away.
Exactly. And what's really cool is he wasn't writing these just for, like, theologians or professors,
Right.
He was having these conversations with everyone, pilots, students, everyday folks. He really believed if you couldn't explain your faith to someone outside your usual circle, you hadn't really, thought it through enough.
He did have that great line about thinking things through, to the absolute ready end.
That's so Lewis. You can practically hear him saying it.
Totally. And it just shows how committed he was to being honest intellectually. Not afraid of the tough questions, and wanted others to be the same way.
Okay, so let's get into one of those tough questions. Lewis talks about how people often feel small, insignificant when they think about how massive the universe is. Like you see those Hubble telescope pictures, the galaxies, and it's easy to feel like a speck of dust.
Yeah.
How can we even matter in all that?
Right. That's the argument from size, as he called it. But Lewis, he actually flips that feeling on its head. He says, this awe we feel, it's not in the universe itself.
What do you mean?
Well, think about it. A monkey looking up at the stars, it doesn't suddenly become like an existential crisis for the monkey. It's us, humans, with our spirit, our need to find meaning. That's what creates that awe.
Wow, that's a really interesting way to look at it.
Yeah.
It's not the size of the universe that makes us feel small. It's how we perceive it.
Exactly.
And that's kind of empowering, right? It's not about some external thing. It's what's inside us.
Totally. And Lewis goes even further. He says this capacity for awe, like being able to grasp how huge the universe is, it could actually be pointing to something beyond us. It's like we're wired to be aware of something bigger calling out to us.
So it's not that we just give the universe meaning, but there's something in us that, recognizes a meaning that's already there.
Yeah, it's a pretty profound thought. And it gets at this back and forth between science and faith that Lewis is always exploring. Like, another big one is this idea that science has proven miracles can't happen.
You hear that a lot.
You do.
But Lewis, he had this really clever way of approaching that, the whole billiard ball analogy.
Right, he's saying the laws of nature, they're like the rules of billiards. They describe a pattern, but they don't cause anything. The rules tell you how the balls move when you hit them, but something else has to start that motion.
Okay, I think I'm following. So even if we know the patterns of nature, like physics, there's still the question of what's making those events happen, what's feeding them into the system.
Yeah.
And that leaves room for something outside of nature to step in, which is basically a miracle, right?
Exactly. And Lewis told this story about a friend who thought, because of modern science, miracles were debunked. But Lewis pointed out that for centuries before materialism became so big, everyone accepted miracles could happen. It was like that knowledge got, deliberately hushed up as science became more popular. It makes you think,
Definitely. What if there's more to the story about science and miracles than we've been told? What if we're too quick to dismiss something just because it doesn't fit how we currently see the world?
And that's the kind of thinking Lewis was always pushing for. He didn't want people just accepting things, especially about faith. He wanted them to dig deeper, ask the hard questions, be open to there being more to reality than we see at first.
So we've got Lewis tackling this idea of the universe, our place in it, and the whole question of miracles and science. But he also had some things to say about what makes Christianity different from other religions.
Yeah, he said you can't just take the miracles out of Christianity without changing what it is. It's not some extra feature. It's woven into the whole thing.
And he uses examples like Buddhism or Islam, right?
Exactly. He pointed out that, sure, other religions might have miracles in their stories, but they're not as essential to what they believe. You could, hypothetically take those stories out and it wouldn't change their core.
Right.
But Christianity, take away the miracles, it's like pulling a thread that makes the whole thing unravel. It's not the same faith without them. He said those miracles, especially Jesus rising from the dead, they're so tied to the Christian message, you can't separate them without messing the whole thing up. So does that make Christianity's claims more believable or less? Big question he leaves us with.
It is a big one. And it kind of leads into another point Lewis makes about how Christianity looks at suffering. He didn't shy away from the tough stuff. In fact, he said Christianity doesn't promise a life without pain or hardship.
Right.
It's not about escaping suffering, but like finding meaning in it, right? And there's this line from Lewis that really stuck with me. He said that if you see suffering as punishment, it can actually be easier to bear.
That's a tough one to wrap your head around. It goes against everything in us that wants to avoid suffering.
It does. But I think what he's getting at is when we see suffering as some random cosmic injustice, it feels even worse.
Mm-hmm.
But if we can reframe it, maybe as the result of our choices or even like a refining process, it becomes something we can deal with, maybe even grow from.
That's a really good way to put it. It's about the purpose in suffering, not just trying to get away from it. And this ties into another big idea Lewis explored, myth, and how it relates to Christianity.
This is where it gets really interesting for me. Lewis loved myth. He saw it as more than just made-up stories, but as a way to understand deep truths about reality that are hard to explain with just logic.
He went as far as saying Christianity itself is a kind of myth, but one that became fact.
Wait, what does that even mean?
So Lewis said the Christian story, it takes this ancient myth that keeps popping up the God who dies and comes back to life, and it makes that myth real in Jesus. It's like he's saying Christianity isn't just rules or doctrines, but it's the fulfillment of something humans have sensed for centuries. He even suggested that the reason the Bible doesn't have the usual mythical figures is because what they were pointing to, that ultimate reality, is now present in Christ.
Wow. Okay, that's a lot to process. So is he saying Christianity is both a myth and real history? How can something be true and mythical?
It is a paradox, isn't it? And it really makes us rethink what we think about truth, myth, and even believing itself. But that's Lewis for you, always more questions than answers.
Makes you wonder what other assumptions we're hanging on to that stop us from seeing things in a new way. And speaking of seeing things differently, Lewis had some interesting thoughts about what he called chronological snobbery.
Oh, yeah, that was one of his, pet peeves. The idea that just because something is newer, it's automatically better, more enlightened. Lewis saw that as a real danger, especially when you're talking about faith and morals.
So it's like saying, oh, that's just an old-fashioned idea. We're past that now. But like Lewis said, sometimes those old-fashioned ideas have wisdom we've forgotten.
Exactly. He was worried about how people were starting to just dismiss the past, thinking that, we're so modern and sophisticated, we don't need traditional beliefs anymore. But he thought that was a dangerous path, one that leads to, a loss of meaning, like spiritual emptiness.
And it's crazy how relevant that feels even now. We're always getting hit with new ideas, new tech, new ways of thinking. It's easy to get caught up in progress without asking where it's taking us.
That's why what Lewis said about critical thinking is so important. He wanted people to really engage with ideas, not just accept them. Think for yourself. Question what you assume. Test things against what's true.
He believed faith and reason could work together, that they actually needed each other. And you see that in all his writing. He's not just appealing to emotion. He's making arguments, using logic, history, even philosophy to back up what he says.
He saw faith not as some blind leap, but like a reasoned response to evidence. The evidence of what we experience ourselves and the evidence in the Christian story. And he wasn't afraid to stand up for his beliefs, even when people were skeptical or disagreed.
He was always debating at the Oxford Socratic Club, right? That group that loved arguing about, everything, including religion.
Yeah, he was actually one of the founders, and it was the perfect place for him. He wasn't just talking to people who already agreed with him. He was with people who saw things differently, challenging them and being challenged right back.
A true intellectual warrior. But he also had this wit, this charm about him. He could make even the most complicated theology, fun and easy to understand.
Absolutely. He was so good at taking those deep ideas and making them relatable, and that's part of why people still connect with his work, even if they don't believe the same things.
Like he's inviting you into this conversation, this exploration. You might not always agree, but you can't help but be interested in how he thinks.
And speaking of interesting thinking, there's another point Lewis makes that I found pretty insightful. It's about language and how important it is to communicate clearly, especially when you're talking about faith.
Oh, tell me more.
So he noticed that a lot of the words used in theology, they either lost their original meaning or they started to mean different things to regular people. Words like sin, grace, redemption, they can sound kind of old-fashioned, even off-putting today.
It's true. You hear those words and it's like they're from a different time.
And Lewis saw that as a barrier to people understanding Christianity. He said if you want to communicate well, you have to speak the language of the people you're talking to. He even said if you can't translate your theological ideas into simple, everyday language, your thinking's probably muddled.
Wow, that's a high standard. It's like, if you can't explain it to a kid, you don't really get it yourself.
Right. It's definitely a challenge. But it shows how important it is to be clear and precise, especially with these big, complex topics.
So it's not about making things dumb. It's about finding ways to make those truths connect with people in a way that makes sense and has meaning.
Exactly. And Lewis was amazing at this. He'd take these complex ideas and put them into stories, analogies, even funny anecdotes to make them come alive.
He was like the ultimate translator of faith, bridging the gap between old and new, sacred and secular.
And that gets to the heart of why Lewis is so engaging. He wasn't just a smart guy, he was a storyteller. And he knew stories have this power to move us, change us, help us see the world in a new light.
He was always reminding us that Christianity isn't just a list of rules, it's a story. A huge, epic story that includes everything about being human. The joy, the sadness, the hope, the despair.
And it's a story that wants us to join in, find our own place in it.
So as we start to wrap up this deep dive into Lewis's thinking, what are some of the key things we should remember?
Well, I think Lewis gives us a way to deal with the intellectual and spiritual blahs that can happen in the modern world. He reminds us to think critically, to engage with ideas, to watch out for that chronological snobbery, to base our lives on something bigger than ourselves, and to find meaning even in the middle of suffering.
And to look for the truth in those old stories, the myths, and see how beautiful and true they can be.
Yeah.
And I think maybe most importantly, he wants us to really think about what it means to be human, our place in this whole huge universe and how we relate to God.
And to remember that, like Lewis said, the very thing that makes us feel small, the vastness of everything, is also showing us how much we're capable of awe and wonder. It's our human spirit that gives meaning to the cosmos.
It really is a powerful thought. It's like he's saying, don't underestimate yourself. The fact that you can even get the idea of infinity, look at the stars, and feel that wonder, that shows how great you are.
Right. And that's a message we all need to hear, I think, especially in a world that can make you feel like just another cog in the machine, a consumer, a data point. Lewis is reminding us we're more than that. We're made in God's image, capable of love, creativity, compassion, and this deep desire for truth.
And that desire for truth, to understand the world and our place in it, that's something Lewis never took lightly. He was always learning, always curious, always searching, always growing. And he never stopped pushing himself and his readers to go deeper, think harder, ask the tough questions.
He was so good at taking what we thought we knew and flipping it around, making us see it from a whole new angle. That's what makes his work last. It's not about giving us easy answers. It's about helping us ask better questions.
And those questions, maybe they'll lead us closer to the truth, to understanding ourselves better, the world, and that mystery we call God.
So to wrap up our deep dive into C.S. Lewis's amazing essays, I want to leave you with one last thought. If the way we're in awe of the universe is really a reflection of us, our human spirit, what does that tell us about where we belong, what our purpose is in this whole grand scheme?
It's something to think about, to explore, to let it sink in. And maybe, just maybe, it'll spark that wonder and possibility in you, make you appreciate being human even more, and feel more connected to the source of it all.
Until next time, keep exploring, keep questioning, keep diving deep.
Keep searching for the truth wherever it takes you.